So I'm going to Scotland first to talk about progressive faith. And to talk about progressive faith in a country that, much like all of Western Europe, both coasts of the United States, as well as a great deal of Australia, South Africa, and Eastern Asia, have found that religion is mostly a matter of nostalgia, of memory, of history. Something Muslims appear to be very enthusiastic about still, but most of the rest of us seem to be pretty eager to just be done with it. At the Science and Faith Conference in Malvern, England, I'll be stuck at the end of a series of lectures delivered by scientists, philosophers, physicians, and psychologists who will be talking on the theme of what it means to be a person. I think that's a little bit backwards, putting me at the end, because I really think it was religion that started out pretty much making a person out of everything. In the ancient strata of religious belief, there was a practice that people in my trade call personification. In the ancient world, we tended to interpret almost every aspect of the universe through human emotion, projecting onto nature characteristics of a person. The earth was generally female. Sometimes the violent and capricious seas became male deities, as did the sky itself. Myths were created for why the days get longer in the summer, shorter in the winter, why plants die but come back in the spring, why it's so cold in winter but always warms up in the spring. And these stories, these myths, accounted for how the sun was drawn on a chariot or a boat through the sky every day, and why the winds came and went with rain and drought and floods and diseases and insects. Primitives gave personhood to things that we can see clearly are not persons. Unlike the ancients, when you plant your spring garden, your vegetable garden, you won't start by opening the earth and putting a little clay figurine of a female deity with exaggerated hips and breasts to call for her blessing of fertility on your tomatoes. We're pretty sure, and now you're ready to try it, most of us, other than Eric, are pretty sure that water and nutrients have more efficacious effect on our vegetables than do our prayers and our sacrifices. But in previous centuries, it made sense to try to communicate with the gods, who do seem to be so capricious. Through our prayers and our sacrifices, we might get them on our side to ensure our survival through the challenges of a growing season. Our ancestors believed, literally, that gods lived on top of mountains, or in the clouds, or deep under the sea, or hidden within the earth, deep within the caverns and caves underneath us. When I was in graduate school, I had the good fortune of getting to hear some lectures delivered by the famous and controversial Catholic theologian Hans Küng. And Küng was imploring us to break out of our old ways of thinking about God and to engage in a new and more vital way of conceiving of God. He talked about old religions as being the God of the gaps. Whatever you don't understand, whatever threatens you, whatever mystifies you, we used to call that God. In the primitive world, everything seemed to have a spiritual dimension to it. The weather, the growing season, whether your hunt was successful or not, whether your children survived childhood, whether your spouse delivered children. Before modern medicine, demonic or divine attribution was given to every illness, almost every turn of fate. Even the realizations of such things as the fact that the world is not flat and the earth is not the center of the universe flew in the face of early religious assumptions. But that was the God of the gaps being driven out of modern thinking. In a scientific age, in the era of growing understandings of botany, medicine, astronomy, There are always still, in spite of our explosion in scientific knowledge, there's always limits to it. You know, we get to the point where the Big Bang, that's the explanation for the beginning of the universe. And that's why all planets and stars are moving away from each other. But then recently we discover they're speeding up. I mean, the logic of gravity from the Big Bang should be that expansion would be slowing down, but they're speeding up, so there must be something else. And, you know, I love even the language of dark matter and dark forces. That is, we have no evidence for its existence other than the fact that it must be there, otherwise it wouldn't be working this way. There's always a limit to how far our knowledge goes, and spiritual people have tended always then to say, well, then God. You know, when the suggestion that the earth was not the center of the universe, but rather the earth rotated around the sun, that the earth was not flat, but rather spherical, like the other planets that we could see in the sky, there was fear that religion would die, that the church would go out of existence if people believed such things. But over time, we just pushed God a little farther away. There was a time, once we accepted the orbits of planets and their shape, we still didn't know why the moon didn't just fall into the surface of the earth. We didn't know why the earth didn't just get pulled into the gravitational pull of the sun. And so originally people would say, God does it. God holds those things in place. When your faith is in a God of the gaps, then every time there is a scientific explanation for why things are the way they are, then you need God just a little bit less. And the whole business of faith looks a little more embarrassing, a little more primitive. So when we see Christopher Hitchens or other famous atheists making a summary dismissal of religion, inevitably what they are dismissing is that supernatural theistic God of the gaps. And since we see ourselves as being terribly enlightened and clever people, we have no need for that God anymore. We just need to do a little more research, do a little more thinking about it, a little more hypothesizing, and we'll have it all figured out. Yet rarely a day goes by that I don't get a message from one of our YouTube or iTunes listeners who doesn't tell me that they consider themselves to be an atheist, but they have found some appreciation for our approach to spirituality. And I generally have to tell them, the God that you don't believe in is the God that I don't believe in. You read Mark Twain's cynical reflections on Christianity of turn-of-the-century America, and you realize the God that Mark Twain didn't believe in is the God we don't believe in. You hear Bertrand Russell's frustration with people's attachment to superstition and mythology, and you realize the God that Bertrand Russell worked so hard to dismiss, we have also dismissed. The God of the gaps, the creation of superstition and magic, that combination of pre-science simplicity is not what draws us here. We're not here trying to get in touch with the God who will help us find a parking place at the mall during the Christmas season or will bless our cucumbers and zucchini and tomatoes. And yet people are terribly afraid to give up on the institutional religious packaging that did first introduce us to a religious life. The images that brought us to faith initially don't hold water. They're not intellectually credible, but we still have trouble letting go of them. And I want to be quick to say that I don't think that we should set the cathedrals of the world on fire. I don't despise our religious tradition. I don't think it's worthless. I don't think it's bad. When you were in middle school, your science teacher began to teach you about the building blocks of the universe. You were shown a model of an atom. Now there are 118 known elements, the most simple being the hydrogen atom with 1 proton and 1 electron. The periodic table takes you through various levels of complexity of combinations of protons, neutrons, and electrons, with electrons orbiting the atom's core in varying levels of electronic shells. The first shell can only hold 2 electrons, the next can hold 8, the third one can hold 18, and then it goes up from there. There's actually a formula. 2 times n squared that tells you how many electrons can be in each shell, and that formula almost always works out, although atoms can't do math, and so it's not perfect. You work with these models, these drawings, for so long that you come to assume that an atom actually looks like a blue and green ball in the center of something spiraling around that's lit up like a Christmas light. You think they're literally shells, which of course is totally absurd. You can't see an atom, but if you could see an atom, you wouldn't know what you were looking at. The model just helps you to think about atoms, to think about elements, to think about the construction of the universe. As such, the models are helpful. I mean, who among us could have ever gotten our heads around it without the use of those models? They're not absolutely true, but they are suggestive of what is true. The problem would be if we had scientists who acted like religious fundamentalists, who insist that everyone has to believe in exactly that model. And if you vary from that model at all, if you deviate in the slightest way, then you're no longer a scientist, but in fact, you are a dangerous heretic. And you see what comes of that. Your elementary or middle school science teacher was not a liar. That teacher was not an idiot. You were being introduced to concepts that would have been impossible to grasp without some stepping stones that brought you into the conversation through models and images that help us to understand. It's just that your introduction shouldn't be the sum total of what can be known. Is it absolutely necessary that the religion that you inherited when you were 7 and 8 years old is as far as you can go? Is that as complicated, is that as deep as we can penetrate? All of the world's religions have tried through the centuries to find a way to put into words what we existentially experience of the grand mystery, of the divine presence. Sometimes the efforts of Buddhists and Hindus and Muslims and Christians and Jews has been helpful and brilliant. And honestly, sometimes they get it totally wrong. Completely wrong. Sometimes they create a model that's helpful to solve a problem that existed in the 4th century that doesn't exist in the 21st century. The model doesn't translate well as the world itself changes. As spiritually insightful as we find the literature to be in the Hebrew Bible, the New Testament, the Quran, or in any of the Buddhist or Hindu or Confucian texts that you might read, none of those texts were written by a person that had the faintest idea of where the sun goes at night. Not a one of them. None of them. None of the authors of any of those texts would have even believed that things like television or airplanes were even possible. They lived in a different world. They used different images and different ideas to express themselves. They were not evil. They were not stupid. But they were the product of their ancient societies. And they spoke in the images that were relevant to their societies. For cultures in which animal sacrifice to appease an angry god or to keep demons out of your house was a fresh memory, then saying that Jesus had to die in substitution for our sins made a certain amount of sense. You could make sense out of that if you were a part of a culture that understood animal sacrifice. But shortly after the notion of atonement was articulated, the temple itself, where animal sacrifice took place for Jews, was destroyed just a very few years after Jesus was dead. And so the whole practice of animal sacrifice goes out of existence, but then we're forced then to try to make people say that they still believe in a sacrifice for atonement, that you were so bad that God had to kill his son. And the only way you can get people to believe something that absurd is to say, if you don't believe it, you're going to go to a special lake of burning fire forever. First, God demands the blood of his own son for something he didn't do, and he'll do even worse for you if you don't act like you appreciate the gesture. I mean, at the worst, Jesus was dead for 3 days, but God threatens to burn you forever if you don't believe it. I think at the bottom line, God simply needed a better publicist. What people had experienced was that somehow the words, the teachings, the example of Jesus made them feel differently, made them feel like they understood the world better, made them feel somehow that they experienced God more intimately. But then they had to answer the difficult question, if he was so special, why did he have to die? And from that point on, every explanation made less sense than the last one. The atonement led to the development of the model of the Trinity, and a lot of the politics behind Trinitarian doctrine was to be sure that God didn't have any more kids, that God, their monotheistic God could have one, but couldn't have another or a third or a fourth. In philosophical terms, the notion of the Trinity solved a problem in the 3rd and 4th century. But once you apply critical thinking to it, it doesn't hold water. So then you have to enforce the doctrine. You believe this, or you're outside of the kingdom. You believe this, or you don't get to go to heaven. You believe this, or you burn in hell. Jesus and his teachings get lost in that doctrinal exchange. Behind each of the world's religions, there was, beyond the simple myths and personifications of aspects of nature, in Zoroastrianism, in Judaism, in Buddhism, in Hinduism, there was an innate desire to be a good person. What does it mean to lead a good life? How can I, as an individual, connect with others to make the world a better place? That's the heart of all of the world's religions. That heart gets obscured by every doctrine and creed and theological ritualistic practice. Take away all the magic and superstition, and what you're left with is a spiritual worldview that calls our humanity, that calls us to lay down our weapons, to share our bread, to love and forgive our brothers and sisters. In an interview about one of her biographies, Karen Armstrong tells the story that when she was a young nun being educated in theology, she was assigned to write a paper on the resurrection. And when the papers were being handed back, her nun, who was the professor in that class, said to her, "It's a very well written paper. You're going to have an outstanding career in this order." And Karen Armstrong said, "Well, thank you, but honestly, none of it is true, is it?" And the nun whispered back, "Of course not, just don't tell the others." It's been the church secret for generations that the particulars are not true, but somehow the myths carry us forward into the process of being better people. The problem is, of course, trying to nail down a definition of God in the first place. I've loved what Bill Maher said 25 or 30 years ago. "I believe in God. I just don't believe that anyone on earth knows as much about God as my dog knows about how to balance my checkbook." I'm deeply indebted to the work of the recently deceased Marcus Borg, who has given a lot of us permission to be enthusiastic about our faith, but completely indifferent towards our dogma. One of the most beautiful lectures I've ever heard, Marcus Borg delivered at the Chautauqua Institute in New York a few years ago, and he talked about the Apostles' Creed. Those of you that grew up with some familiarity of the Latin liturgy, the Apostles' Creed begins, "Credo in Deum Patrem Omnipotent," which translates into English very simply, "I believe in God the Father Almighty." But obviously we get the word creed, the Apostles' Creed, from the first word in Latin, credo. Borg says that we moderns tend to see credo as "I believe" in a very fact-literal way. But he says in the ancient world, language of that sort was more poetic, it was more artistic. And he said we would get closer to what they meant when they said that if we would translate it, "I belove." That is, I love the tradition of the church. I can love some of the old traditional hymns. I can love that Christmas story. I can love the Easter celebrations. I love the tradition of Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. I love the Christian tradition of incarnation, atonement, resurrection, sacraments in Scripture, because it is through that. It was through those primitive models that I was introduced to a life of faith. I don't have to pour concrete around it, though. I don't have to be dogmatic about it. I don't have to say that I have to understand my relationship with God that way through all of time. Frankly, wouldn't that be silly? But it would be just as silly to let us despise our own roots. You don't have to despise your middle school science teacher to begin to study subatomic particles because in my case, she wasn't lying to us. She just wasn't ready to tell us about quarks, bosons, and mesons until we had figured out the protons, neutrons, and electrons. What is inescapable is that we have an experience of the divine other that even though we cannot fully or accurately describe the divine, we know that we have to try. And you have an experience of the holy, of the mystery. You have to try to talk about it. But language is not God. Scripture is not God. Even the universe is not God, though we experience God within it. By faith, we reason that God is something more than just all the rocks and trees and planets and stars added together, that it is what we experience in the good, that peace is better than war, that love is better than hate, that kindness is better than violence, that generosity is better than greed. Those aren't facts. Those are experiences. You've heard the modern proverb that money can't buy love, but money can buy bacon. And that's pretty close. Now, none of us would say that bacon is superior to love or even like love, but bacon is a thing. When you go to the restaurant, you're going to get 2 pieces or 3. When you fall in love, you're not exactly sure how this is going to turn out. You don't know when it comes and when it goes away. You can't quantify it. You cannot, from things, intuit your spirituality. You do have to feel your way through it. But you also have to think to lead yourself to that opening. We know, if only because we experience it, that we can live in a way that draws us closer into communion with God and with one another, and that there are ways of living that alienates us from each other or from God. And after many centuries and any number of just embarrassing religious wars, inquisitions, and excommunications, we realize that we need to stop trying to regulate how anyone else talks about God. We need to stop trying to say, you have to affirm my perspective. And our Muslim brothers and sisters are going to have to accept what we Christians had to accept a long time ago. What is sacred to us is not sacred to other people. And that if a Danish cartoonist wants to draw a picture of Muhammad with a bomb as a turban, that is his right. You don't have to like it, you don't have to agree with it, but you cannot regulate it. We can love the tradition that brought us to where we are now, but we can also let go of all the claims that we ever pretended to have that our truth is universal, that other people can only experience God if they experience God through the same path that we did. If love is our religion, then folks, here's the good news. No one ever has to go to hell again. No one ever has to be afraid of God or demons. And no one can tell you what to believe. The formal institutional religion through which almost all of us were reared helped us to think. It helped us to battle our self-destructive impulses and to learn how to choose the good rather than the bad. Just like you spend the first several years of life in school learning how to stand in line, eventually you need to learn how to get out of line, to let go of the institution, to move beyond the models and the drawings, and to be freed, to be a spiritual person without boundaries, doctrines, or creeds. During my early education, Bertrand Russell was despised for being a rather snide and condescending atheist. I wish that the church had been more willing to listen to what he actually had to say. Our fact-literal application of ancient myths and personifications of nature was robbing the modern world of its potential for joy, for love, for liberty, for freedom. Once you can train a child to believe things for which there is absolutely no evidence whatsoever, then you can make them show loyalty to a religious code or system that makes fathers and mothers despise their own children if they turn out to be gay, or if they ever get a divorce or commit a crime. You can convince people to wear a bomb into a crowded marketplace, or murder an artist or filmmaker who demeans your culture. If you can make a child believe in the literal truth of a list of unprovable myths, then it's no great leap to say that that same child can forever then be seduced into becoming the tool of a dictator or of a very violent political ideology. What your great British philosopher was saying to all of us was just this: I wish, for the sake of us all, that you would not believe in anything for which there is no evidence. Doesn't mean that it's not true, but if there's no evidence, there's no reason to discuss it. Maybe you have an aura. Maybe you are the reincarnation of Queen Nefertiti. But do us all a favor, keep it to yourself, because if there's no evidence, there's really no reason for conversation about it. Our religious dogmas and creeds and symbols are intimate, perhaps personally meaningful, but they cannot be normative. They cannot be pushed off on society. Look at us here. We're still battling about whether we can give equal rights to gays and lesbians. In Kansas, the governor found out that a previous governor had done that years ago, and he struck it down because it was too restrictive. I wish that we could hold a public vote about whether Republicans can get married or not. I just think, you know, if you're going to restrict the rights of one group of people, we ought to be able to restrict the rights of another. You know, once you declare that you're going to have a vote like that, then you see the absurdity of any one group of people trying to take rights away from another group of people. Russell wasn't trying to take away ethics, the sense of community, compassion, and love that is inherent in a spiritual life. He was asking us to set aside magic and superstition that leads us into violent extremism, divides family members against one another, and makes being a human being something that should be filled with shame and self-loathing, that you're afraid of your own body, your own sexuality, your own natural, instinctive, evolutionary appetites. I suspect that most people who have slowly abandoned a life of faith are not quite sure why they did. They may tell you that they're spiritual, but not religious. What they are feeling is that the old myths, the stories developed in a Palestinian wilderness on a flat earth centuries ago, no longer have any power for them. And so they drift away, not really sure why, but very much relieved to be free of the constraints, the tedious hymns, the uncomfortable clothing, and the dead rituals they associate with religious practice. My fear is that they are also losing a great deal of what makes them human. Isn't our connection to one another what makes us human? If you were an individual on an island all by yourself, would you really be human? Isn't it our connection that gives us our humanity? Isn't it friendship and affection and family? Isn't it showing compassion to those who are in need, caring for those who are ill, giving direction and encouragement to the young, and companionship to the elderly? For me, it's never been about heaven and hell. It's never been about invisible angels or demons. It was never about the Trinity or Christmas or Easter. For me, it was always about the connection. When those stories and those myths were the common ground of our connection, there was no reason to put any of them under the microscope. Now, with the myths and superstitions being stripped away in modern society, we are left with naked reality. What is and what is not. Now there's only us. Now we either love each other or we reject each other. I'm saying that love is better. Heck, we've tried the other way. It didn't work. Love is the better way.
You have been watching a progressive Christian video from the Community Christian Church of Springfield, Missouri. We encourage our viewers to donate to our efforts in feeding the homeless and hungry of our community. Write to us at Reverend Dr. Ray at AOL.com for more information.